Hey folks, Johnny Simcoe here, and today I want to talk about how to prepare your logo design to be delivered to your client. And what do I kind of mean by that? Well, let's look at a couple of notes right here. There's a couple of things you want to do when you think your logo design is complete. One, you want to generate all your fonts into actual outlines. That way you no longer have a dependency on the font file, and there's no way of accidentally converting that typeface into something else because a font isn't installed on a system. So you want to lock down your type by outlining all your fonts. Two, you want to make sure you cut out any augmented holes that you've made in the design. So if you've augmented a closed counter, for example, you want to make sure that it's really a hole and you don't just have a chunk of color on top of another solid object. Then you want to make sure all your strokes are rendered out into shapes. So if you're using a stroke on an object and you have a certain stroke weight in the stroke palette, and maybe you've got some rounded end caps or a stroke profile, you actually want to generate that into a shape so it's no longer dependent on the stroke information in the stroke palette. And lastly, you want to union shapes together to remove any overlapping geometry. Now, these statements at the moment might seem a little vague, but I'm going to demonstrate all of this using this little logo I designed earlier, little Bots Toys logo. So let's go through this step by step and let's see how this is built and then how we can sort of generate it into more solidified artwork to deliver to a client. So if I hit Command Y and go into outline mode, you can see the structure, the paths making up this logo. And there's some lines over here. These are simply strokes. The antenna has a curved line. That is also just a stroke. So if I hit Command Y, go back into preview mode, you'll see that the antenna just has a stroke weight of 7. These little guys off to the side have a stroke weight of about 13, and they have a rounded end cap, adding a little curve to the stroke. The head is also, that's just a stroke as well. It's about 13 points. So there's a lot of strokes at play for the design of the head here. If you look at the type, the bots, the word bots has already been outlined. It was a typeface that was augmented, some curves were added to it, there's a little bit of tweaking on the letter Z. So this is already converted to outlines and augmented. However, the word toys is still live type. That's a live font, and that can be changed at any time by going into your font menu and putting it to whatever you like. So that's actually still a typeface. The gear is simply a white gear on top of a circle, and it's basically serving as the closed counter in the O, just to give it a little more character. So it's a pretty straightforward design here, using just some basic shapes and a lot of strokes, because that's easier to do than draw all these curves by hand with the Bezier tool. So that is essentially my final design. Now it does have some nice negative space. There's this great little curve as the robot head sort of tucks behind, or gives the illusion that it's kind of tucking behind the characters here. So that's kind of nice. So let's just say this is my final design. I'm liking the look of it. I like the white negative space that's living between the letters and the icon on top. What happens when I take this now and put it on a color? So let's turn on a background color. Oh boy, so we got some problems here. It turns out that what I thought was some really nice open negative space, essentially transparency and alpha channel in here, well, it turns out it's actually just a white stroke. So if I click on, say, the letter T, it's got a black fill and it has a white stroke. And when it's on a white background, that stroke looks like it's biting into the head a little bit and making this beautiful little curvature that aligns nicely to the T. But really, all that's going on, if I select the head and nudge it around, you'll see, let's do this again, let's select the head and move it. There's the head in its entirety, and by having that white stroke, it allows me to carefully nudge that around freely and see how those curves act with the type. Really nice way of just kind of putting that negative space in there without having to actually hack away at the geometry while you're working on the project. So let me undo that just a little bit. Okay. So the problem is, in reality, when it's all said and done, is you do have black type with a white stroke. Now I have another problem. I got some close counter issues. There is a close counter in the B. It has a white stroke, but there is a little bit of a hole there, but there's no hole up here. There is a gear serving as the close counter, the O, but that's also not transparent. So what I really got to do is make all this white stuff go away, basically have it subtract out of the black parts of the logo, so there truly is some negative space. And even the word toys gets weird. Again, if we look at it on white, there's this nice little gap between toys and the bottom of the T and the Z. Turn the background on, it turns out the toys is kind of overlapping just ever so slightly on that white stroke. So we gotta go through those steps that I mentioned earlier and see if we can convert all these strokes, typefaces and whatnot into solidified lockdown pieces of artwork. So I'm going to leave my background on because I do want to make sure while I'm working with this, if it's still on a white background, I might not be seeing things the way they should be viewed. So we're going to keep a color back here to ensure that as I subtract information, there truly is transparency coming through where it's supposed to come through. So before I get going, I just realized I moved my little top of the antenna here. Let's put that little guy back there. Yeah, that's good enough for now. My first tip was to outline your type. So the word bots was already rendered into outline, so I don't have to mess with that at all. So let's start with the word toys. This is like one of the easiest things to take care of in this process, is simply outlining your type. So I'm going to go into type, create outlines, and now that typeface has been rendered out into artwork. Easy enough. Type is pretty straightforward. Next, I want to talk about strokes. So right here, let's say this antenna, for example, that is a spline. It's a quarter of a curve, and what's giving it the illusion of the thickness is the stroke setting. So I actually want to go ahead and create that into actual geometry, a filled object. So I'm going to go under my object menu. I'm going to do path, outline, stroke. And what that's going to do, if I go back into my artwork, instead of just seeing just that thin line, I now actually have a shape that aligns to what I was seeing with that stroke setting. So it has the curve and the thickness that was set in the stroke palette. And now as a filled object, it's no longer reliant on the stroke weight that's located in the stroke palette. Same thing with the little ears here. Let's grab these guys and let's go object, path, outline, stroke, and that's going to generate them into a shape. They also took on not only the thickness of the stroke, but also the rounded end cap. So now that's actually solid filled geometry. It's no longer reliant on the stroke data. And the same thing with the head. This is got about a 13-point stroke on it. Let's go object, path, outline, stroke. And now if we go back into outline view, you can see the shapes are here. They're not just strokes any longer. And one of the reasons for doing that is, one, once it's outlined, it's really hard to manipulate. If I give someone the AI file, which you would seldom do anyhow, but if they mess with that stroke weight, it's going to really throw off the design. And also, you can't really union or subtract out geometry using your pathfinders when they're just strokes. They usually have to be some form of shape. For example, up here, I've got a circle. I have a shape that was the stroke of the antenna, but it was outlined, so now it's a shape. And then I have this shape over here, which is the head. And again, that was a stroke that was now outlined into a shape. What I really want to do is clean up the overlapping artwork. And I can do that. Let's just start up here with these two. You highlight these two objects, you go to your pathfinder, and you union them together. And now it's a really clean piece of geometry. You can't do that with a stroke. So all those strokes have to be rendered out into shapes so that you can perform this next task. That's kind of the whole point of outlining those strokes. Now I can do the same with the head. I'm going to grab the antenna and the head. I'm going to go to my pathfinder, union that together. When I hit Command Y, it all looks the same. Like the design hasn't changed, but the geometry has changed quite a bit underneath. It's now this really nice, clean, ongoing, beautiful shape with no overlapping areas. Really nice, really clean. So that's good. So next, I want to take care of the strokes that are on the letters here. I'm going to highlight all my characters. I'm going to go Object, Path, outline stroke. When I outlined strokes earlier, they were simply strokes. Now I have an object that has a fill and a stroke on it. So when I outline the stroke and move the object, the fill and the stroke move together. But they're actually two different components now. So if I hit Command-Shift-G to ungroup, you'll see the stroke and the fill are two separate elements. It's just when you outline them, Illustrator keeps them grouped together, which, often you do want to have them grouped together. You want to outline them for some other purpose, but then you want them to move together. So I'd say half the time you want them grouped, half the time you don't want them grouped. So just be mindful that when you outline an object that has a fill and a stroke, that they'll be grouped together and you're going to have to ungroup them. Now in the case of the Z here, I can take that stroke and just delete it. I don't need it. It doesn't affect the design at all. I can simply get rid of it. Now in the case of the T, if I get rid of it, let's ungroup it first. If I get rid of it, I lose that bite mark in the robot, that little curve that was there. So I'm going to use this stroke to minus out of that shape. So I'm going to select this stroke, select the robot head, and minus it. And there it is. That is the negative space I'm looking for. I'm going to do it with the O. Let's minus that out. Now that minused weird. The head actually took away from the stroke instead of the reverse because this has to be on top. Let's put that on top. Let's select this. There we go. Minused out that nice curve right there. Select the head and minus that out. Okay, so now something weird happened. I lost a couple of shapes. I noticed there's a little something right here. And I think when I minused out the O, let's hit Command-Y, it left behind some weird little piece of artwork. This happens. This is not an exact science. It does take a little bit of kind of hacking through your design. Sometimes weird stuff happens, like you'll get these little fragmented artifacts. So I'm going to take my direct selection tool, just go ahead and delete that. It was just something that was still attached to the head that was causing the subtraction malfunction, shall we say. So let's try this again. Let's select the outline in the head, minus it out. That's better. So now you can see that nice negative space that I was talking about earlier. It's actually a transparency. It's really transparent. It's really a negative space. And of course, when I drop the logo on another background, instead of a white stroke, there'll actually be transparency there. Okay. So last, I just got to knock out any other holes. So I'm going to select the gear, the circle, and let's minus that out. And there we go. Now it is truly on a transparency. So I can put any color back here, and let's go back to the white. That's it. That's essentially how the design was, but now instead of having the illusion of transparency by using white on top of white, the paths are now mathematically and structurally sound. This is how it should be. It locks down the artwork, and it really can't be easily manipulated afterwards. So this really solidifies the artwork. Whoa, wait, just a minute. I got one more quick thing to show you in case you don't really believe everything I just demonstrated to you. So here I am inside some 3D software, and let's say your client wants to do a little 3D model, just something simple like an extrusion of the logo you just made for them. This is what the corrected version of that logo imports as. You can see all the shapes are intact, and if I go ahead and extrude it, there's my 3D logo. And that looks just fine. However, if I go to the original logo that was not modified, here's how it imports. And you can see, instead of having a shape, a rounded shape for the ears, I just have that one line from Illustrator. The same thing with the antenna. It's just that one single line. It's not actually a shape. You'll also notice the word toys is missing because it wasn't outlined. So really all that was in Illustrator was simply a single point baseline, and because we picked a particular typeface and typed some characters, Illustrator generated the text on the screen for us. So if it's not outlined, it doesn't import into the software. Now you can make out the bots, but remember I had all those outlines going on, the stroke? Again, that's all coming in all sorts of weird. So this is not a good import of that original logo. So when I extrude this, it gets all kind of funky looking, so that is not what the logo is supposed to look like. You might say, well, I'm not going to do a 3D rendering of my logo. It doesn't really matter. At some point, if this logo is going to go through any sort of manufacturing process, this is what's going to happen. It's going to come out really weird looking, whether it's a vinyl cut or it's a laser cut out of wood, whatever it might happen to be. It's going to be a challenge to do. And what's going to happen is the person managing that project is going to look at the logo and be like, that's not right. And then they're going to have to go through the process I did earlier to make it correct. And that's actually going to cost your client some additional money in order to get that conversion made. Okay, well, this is very long, very winded. I hope it helps out in the end. Thanks for listening. And here's the final closing.